Picture this, the mountains of Arizona. You've got a cactus sticking up your arse. For some reason, we won't ask why. The sunrise gently coming over the mountains, ready to burn your face to a crisp in the midday sun. Suddenly, a strange figure appears beneath the shadows, with a wide variety of beasts following behind. Cut. Basically, right, in Arizona in the 1950s, there was a guy called Dale Lee, and he was a professional houndsman. Now, Dale Lee, he wasn't just any houndsman. He wouldn't go hunting for what he called trash. Oh no, he would go hunting for mountain lions. Now, this lion hunter actually managed over 60 hounds in his time. And you can probably imagine how difficult it is to keep your hounds around when you're off hunting. So what Dale Lee needed was basically something that would keep his hounds obeying even at long distance. Now introduce Frank Hoover. Now, Frank Hoover was a retired army-trained engineer who favoured aeroplane models. And Dale Lee, he hired Frank Hoover to basically bring his concept of a device to life. Now, what they came up with was a device that basically used transistor radio electronics to be able to communicate with your dog at a distance, like a radio. However, it was far from the radio that you're probably thinking of. Now, in the early 1960s, they actually came up with the first idea of what we now know as the shock collar. Now, this first came about with the ability collar and the sensortronic. Now, what these were, they were really ugly looking things and heavy. All of the electronics sat inside this big, chunky wooden or metal box that sat on the dog's collar. And you had a remote for it with like a mile-long antenna. Now, what this had was one singular button. What this button done was shock Dale Lee's dogs. Now, once people started to realise that it was effective in training their dogs, enter the Boatman era. Now, the Bill Boatman catalogue, which I'm going to put right here, actually advertised a new type of shock collar, which was called the Super Heterodyne Electronic Dog Collar. Try saying that 10 times fast. Now, in the 1960s, this was actually priced for $249.99, which you can imagine in the 60s was quite a lot. Kind of inflate that to today's society, where you actually can't even buy a house anymore unless you've got $500,000 sat in the bank. You'd actually be looking around about $2,100 for one of these collars. Now, the first generation of these collars actually used transistor radio electronics to communicate with dogs. Now, there were a couple of problems with this. Number one being something that Boatman actually raved about, which is that it provided 700 shocks per second. Now, if you're someone who sat there wondering, well, Abby, I'm not quite sure what that is. Is that good? Is that bad? Well, let me put it into perspective for you. A car spark plug, on average, will provide 5.8 sparks per second. I'm just going to let that sink in quickly. Now, these collars, if you think about it, were pretty much the equivalent to someone sitting in an electric chair at the local prison. Not only that, but the antennas would break really easily. If they become waterlogged, well, forget about it, and your dog's fur will never recover. And not only that, but they were often interrupted by airplane signals over radios. So if an airplane went overhead, your dog's collar would simply set off all by itself. Now, as with all technology, it does start to get better through the decades. So enter the 70s. Now, in the 70s, they started to miniaturize and fiddle around with the controls of these collars. Now, what this meant, basically, that they began to have a collar that didn't have any interference from any other radio waves or anything like that. So you couldn't accidentally shock your dog anymore. That's great. but we still had the 700 shocks per second with no other levels, just that one. Now in the 80s, we actually became a bit more educated about this type of technology and how to use them. And we started to become a bit more wise on animal welfare as well. Now what this meant is that we started to add different things to these collars, which included an audio frequency tone, which was basically a high-pitched noise or a low buzz. And the reason that this came about is because people actually started to look into canine behavior and welfare. Finally. Now, the 90s, this is where the game started to change with the introduction of the microprocessor. Now, basically what this done was allow different levels within your dog's shock collar. So instead of just having 700 shocks per second, you could change it to low, medium, and high. However, this was a little bit tricky because you still had to change components of your collar, and things were quite easy to lose. So if you're anything like me and you forget where you've put your keys in the last 5 minutes, well, this collar probably wasn't very useful to you. Now jump forward again to the modern day era. I know technology now can be quite scary, but hang on, stay with me, okay? In today's world, we have now changed from shock collar to e-collar. Now, I did try to look for a shock collar for you. Turns out you can't find them anywhere. The only one that I've managed to find online is actually locked away in a museum in Tennessee. But for those that wanted to see one, I found a picture. This is what they look like. Now, today we have the modern e-collar, and it is very, very different and a far cry from the 1900s or 20th century shock collar that we used to have. The antennas are much, much smaller. The remotes are much smaller. In fact, here's one here. And actually the device itself that sits on the dog's neck is itty bitty, and you can get them small enough to fit your out of control dash hound. Now that's not the only difference in features between then and now. Another feature is we have more than one button. So these devices now consist of a vibration, an audible tone. You can even get GPS tracking on them these days. And they also come with a dial that ranges from 0 to 100. And we're not jumping up in 10s, not even 5s here, people, okay? We jump up by 1s from 0 to 100 in level. Now, the use these days isn't to cause pain. It's not to cause fear. It's actually to interrupt a behavior or a thinking pattern of your dog. And there's a specific way that it does this, which is very different from its predecessor. Now, modern e-collars no longer use that barbaric electrocution system that they used way back when. They actually now use transcutaneous electrical nerve stimulation. And if that has ever sounded similar to you, that's because in this day and age we typically know it as TENS. And basically, in simple terms, what this does is provides a DC voltage, which is literally microseconds per pulse. So instead of 700 sparks per second, we get a DC voltage of a microsecond per pulse instead of a constant stream of sparks. Now what this does is actually just deliver a mild adjustable electrical pulse to the muscle, a bit like TENS physiotherapy. Now these also have some very nice safety features within them as well, such as the fact that they are completely waterproof. So my dog will happily go swimming in her favourite river and get caked in God knows what, including soaking wet mud, and it has no effect on the collar whatsoever. So she can go about enjoying her life whilst wearing it. Not only that, but there is no interruption on these guys. You can actually have a whole team of dogs wearing them at the same time and one will not set off the other. So basically what this allows is for trainers to use the least invasive method, focusing on muscle stimulation and sensation for communication. Now guys, I will say, if you still are unsure what a TENS machine is, then all you need to do is go onto Temu, look for the lazy people on there who like to put a TENS machine on them to try and get that really nice six-pack instead of going to the gym. So the thing that you stick to your body in hopes that you'll end up looking like Zac Efron, that's TENS. So the science behind them, and here is where we are going to dispel quite a lot of myths about the stimulation of the modern day e-collar. Now, understanding how the modern day e-collar actually works is essential for informed discussion. The technology in it bears very little resemblance to common misconception, and it operates through precise, controlled electrical pulses rather than continuous shocks. And if you're still not sure about the difference between a pulse and a shock, you can probably go and watch BBC Bite Size. So you're probably asking, Abby, well, how on earth does it actually work then? I'm about to give you the answer. Now, the modern e-collars deliver a pulse direct current, also known as DC for short, not like the opposite of Marvel. Now, this basically happens in microsecond bursts, not a continuous electrical flow. Each pulse is extraordinarily brief. I'm talking a microsecond. What it does is actually create a bit of a tapping sensation, a bit like if you were to flick yourself, rather than a shock. And this sensation produces a gentle muscle contraction, exactly the same as a TENS machine would. Fun fact for you, physiotherapy for dogs can typically end up using TENS for muscle stimulation. For example, if a dog has had a back injury and someone needs to rehabilitate those back muscles, sometimes TENS will be used. Would you say no to that being used on your dog for physiotherapy? I doubt it. So why are we saying no to it for training? Now, the precise control that these modern day e-collars have actually allow trainers to precisely find the lowest perceived level for their dog. And what this lowest intensity level does, actually find where the dog notices it and responds to it. And by respond, I don't mean crying out in pain. When we say the dog's responding to it, we simply mean a slight ear twitch. We have the two distinctive stimulation types between old school and new school. The old school was a very high voltage electric shock that probably burnt your dog's fur to oblivion. And the new school era is a gentle, non-harmful, non-painful muscle contraction. That's it. So to basically conclude, the remote collar has matured from a crude instrument into a highly advanced communication device. Modern e-collars represent sophisticated technology developed through decades of refinement, formed by behavioural science and engineering with canine welfare as a primary consideration. These tools now offer trainers unprecedented precision, multiple communication modes, and safety features that its predecessors could never have imagined. And when used by knowledgeable practitioners following contemporary training protocols, they provide clear, consistent communication that many dogs understand readily. It truly is my hope that the outdated and completely inaccurate term of shock collar will fade from common usage and fade from language altogether. Today's tools bear only superficial resemblance to its predecessors in the form of literally just what it looks like. They are as different as a 1960s cattle prod as a smartphone is from a rotary telephone. And as our language evolves to reflect this technology and philosophical transformation, we move closer to productive discussions grounded in current understanding rather than historical misconceptions. So basically, the future of dog training lies not in choosing between tools and techniques, but in understanding how to use each appropriately within a comprehensive, science-based approach that prioritizes the dog's well-being and the human-canine bond.